One. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Vine Faith in Action. My name is Mike Lagerquist. We are here today with a friend from MSU, both the history department and the Kessel Peace Institute up there, speaking a little bit about the possibility of, and this is just a discussion, changing the name of Sibley Park. That is something that's being looked at a lot more nationwide as the unrest has taken place, and we begin to take a look at those for whom public institutions and parks and those such things are named, to see if there is something we could do to help adjust history, perhaps, to bring all of this in line. So with that, I will pass it off to Jameel and just ask you, Jameel, to introduce yourself real quickly, and then you may certainly proceed. You should have access to the screen.
Yes, thank you so much, Mike, for inviting me to talk to the Vine today. I see some former students, some colleagues from the Betsy Tasty Society as well, which I'm a board member. So welcome everybody, and thank you so much for coming to yet another Zoom meeting. All the work of a meeting with no coffee, no snacks, just computer screens. And I'll say, Mike, talking about ways we've presented or performed in our lives, I think the hardest one I ever did was for the Rotary. I gave this presentation, and it was to people on Zoom and actually in a location. It was very confusing how to judge the audience.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen here. Just give me a second, everybody. And I will ask that if there's any sort of technical issue, please immediately let me know. We had John Bewin a couple of weeks ago at the history department, and you could see his notes. So we had to tell him that. And as Mike was saying, occasionally people's mics will be on. I know when I gave this presentation to the Maverick Diversity Institute last week, some people told me after the presentation that they could, occasionally my internet was cutting in and out. So anything goes wrong, just let me know immediately. I would really appreciate that. I'm not Midwestern, I'm from New York. So my level of how I judge rudeness is very, very much higher than everybody else's here. All right. My name is Jameel Haque. I'm a professor of history here at Minnesota State University, Mankato. And since January of this year, I'm also the director of the Kessel Peace Institute. The Kessel Peace Institute is housed within the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at MSU, and it has a mission to promote peace and social justice. The Kessel, I wanted to say a few words about the Kessel. It was named after Dr. Abbas Kessel. Dr. Kessel was a political science professor at Minnesota State University, Mankato, for nearly 20 years. He was born in Tehran, Iran in 1918, and while working at an Iranian firm tied to the American Armed Forces during the Second World War, Dr. Kessel saw and experienced the negative effects of war and developed a motivation to promote peace, nonviolence, and social justice. In 1946, Dr. Kessel began his studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He became a United States citizen in 1964 and began teaching here at MSU in 1966. Dr. Kessel advocated for nonviolence during the Vietnam War, especially the Vietnam War protests that happened here in Mankato. Some of you may know of the demonstration that shut down Mankato and threatened to turn violent in 1973. Activist Mitch Goodman was also here, and he was trying to stir up some trouble. Dr. Kessel was the voice of reason and peace. After Dr. Kessel died in 1987, his widow, Ruth Miner Kessel, carried on his legacy of peace and social justice by creating the Kessel Institute for the Study of Peace and Change in 1993. Since then, the Institute has had fantastic leadership from Donald Strasser, Barbara Carson, Jackie Vaselli, and Carol Glasser. Now it lumbers on, surviving despite my leadership. Why should we rename Sibley Park? Well, the idea of renaming Sibley Park fits within our local context of reconciliation here in Mankato. This movement is within the larger national context and debate of renaming buildings and removing statues. Renaming will help people, and especially the children that frequent the park locally and around the region, know that we as a town have a commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion in our community. Furthermore, I believe it will help expand the definition of what it means to be a citizen of Mankato. If we truly want all of our children and citizens to wake up in a world that values them, this is a small but necessary step in that direction. So the problem is, as I said, how do we create a Mankato where we privilege every citizen's voice and promote diversity? And whose story is the Mankato story? Do we want our city to be inclusive of all groups or privilege the white settler narrative over all others? As pertains to Sibley Park, the showcase of our city park system, I propose we have a problem. Henry Hastings Sibley was instrumental in the signing of the treaty that led to the Dakota War. Finally, he condemned over 300 people to death, all of whom were prisoners of war and promised fair treatment. These trials took place at Sibley Park. Let's backtrack a little to Henry Sibley. Henry Sibley is looking very heroic here in his equestrian portrait. This picture is from his official website, his official webpage at the Minnesota Historical Society. Now, Sibley was born in Detroit, which makes him an immigrant to Minnesota. And he came, like most immigrants, in pursuit of a job. It was as a fur trader in Minnesota that Sibley established a working relationship with Native Dakota peoples. Henry Sibley later used these relationships to help negotiate a treaty with the Dakota people. Sibley misled Dakota leaders like Little Crow about the content of the Treaty of Traverse De Sioux. It should be noted that from this treaty, Henry Sibley netted $66,000 personally. Dakota tribes only received $60,000. After leaving the fur trade, Henry Sibley became a politician and eventually became the first governor of Minnesota, the Star of the North. His prominence in the state and knowledge of the Dakota led him to be picked as a colonel to prosecute the Dakota War. Historical records show that Sibley was referred to as Minnesota's undertaker because of his lack of showing up after battles. He was not a particularly skilled military leader. In fact, he used the tactic of starvation, the same condition that drove the Dakota to their desperation in the beginning of the war. He used the tactic of starvation and starving out his enemies as his only real military tactic. This slide shows the extent of the treaty that Sibley negotiated, the size of the land ceded, and that's that green area. I hope the color contrast shows up well. The size of the land ceded wasn't the misleading aspect of the treaty. The misleading aspects were the size of the payment from the United States to the Dakota and how that money would be delivered. Much of the payment for the land was to be given in food, which the Dakota were not made aware of. And a good amount of the payment actually went to repay debts that were on Sibley's books to the fur companies. That's how Sibley netted that money. The Dakota were not aware of that payment either. In 1862, it was in fact the withholding of the food promised in that treaty by the US that was one of the main causes of the war. So we know that Sibley's actions leading up to the war were wrong. Why do we have a park named Sibley? And why do so many people insist on not changing the name of the park? Secondly, why is there no monument or even basic acknowledgement of these events in the park? So we return to the question, what should and what will Mankato be known for? We look to our past to determine what we want from our future. Well, there are a few things we are already known for outside of this region. Maud Hart Lovelace's Betsy Tacy series is, in my opinion, the single most positive thing Mankato is known for nationally. I might be biased because I'm a board member of the Betsy Tacy Society. Every summer weekend, tourists from all over this country roam the Lincoln Park neighborhood in search of locations from this book. And yes, Sibley Park is mentioned in this book as Page Park. My friends around the country also know of Mankato as the land of bizarre traffic accidents. Here we have a picture of the dog that crashed a semi-truck into a gas station. The accident that led to the hogs blocking Highway 169 and the New Year's Eve attempted murder of the Profinium building. I just learned this morning that a few years ago also 2 young girls tried to kidnap a goat from Sibley Park, but unfortunately that did not make national news and they were unsuccessful. Sadly, what Mankato is most known for is the hanging of the 38. While the hanging of the 38 happened downtown, much of the events leading to it happened at Sibley Park. After the war wound down, when Sibley called upon the Dakota to surrender, many did. It should be noted that most Dakota did not fight in the war. It was only a small portion that took up arms. When the Dakota surrendered, the elderly, women, and children were force marched up to Fort Snelling and then exiled to South Dakota. Many, if not most of these non-combatants died during this relocation. This occurred directly due to the actions of Sibley, who had promised them safety, not death and exile. The men were incarcerated as prisoners of war at Sibley Park. There they were tried without lawyers by a jury of militia that they had just fought against. Some trials lasted mere minutes, and 303 prisoners of war were condemned to death. Had Sibley had his way, all 303 prisoners of war would have been killed. We all know that individuals like Henry Whipple intervened and that Abraham Lincoln, president at the time, thousands of miles away, dedicated substantial amounts of time, of labor, and of resources to reviewing the trial transcripts. Lincoln, in fact, recommended that only 2 of the prisoners be executed. Sibley demanded more, hence the 38 POWs who were hanged altogether on December 26, 1862. So I believe that renaming Sibley Park fits into the framework and context of Mankato's moves towards reconciliation. These steps have been taken as a whole community, both the indigenous Mankatoans and the immigrants of all periods. The powwow, changing the Mankato state mascot, Reconciliation Park. You are all probably aware of these. Maybe some of you have even helped in these processes. Renaming Sibley Park is another step further towards reconciliation. What about the objections? Objection 1, you're erasing history. Since I announced this initiative earlier in the summer, 2 main objections have been raised. And I'll say we are not erasing history. I'm a historian. You can trust me. We can't do that. And as a historian, I literally write history. I teach it. My students know that history is never a full or necessarily accurate picture of the past, but a nuanced story told for multiple purposes. History is the conglomeration of the stories a society tells itself to reveal what it prioritizes in the present and how it wants to move into the future. What should our history be? It's our town, our time, and we get to determine what our history focuses on. The history that I grew up learning was one of white achievement, particularly white male achievement, and white ethnic triumph over brown people. Think about how Tenzing Norgay, a South Asian man, carried all the equipment up Mount Everest, yet Edmund Hillary gets the credit for being the first person to climb it. What about Magellan? Despite not even managing to achieve his textbook goal of circumnavigating the world, yet gets credit for it. He was not the first person to sail around the world. On his voyage, it was an enslaved person known to history only as Enrique, who, when realizing he was back on his island in Indonesia or the Philippines, that the Portuguese slavers had kidnapped him on, successfully ran away. Dear to the hearts of the American narrative of the Midwest is Lewis and Clark. Well, it would have been a lot harder for them to do it without York, the enslaved person that carried all their things for them. Where are they, these individuals, in history books? History is both biased and inaccurate. It represents the bias of the historian and our society and the vision of what that time and place, the now, values. History is a mirror of what we value now, not what people valued in the past. What do we in 2020 in Mankato value? Do we privilege Sibley's role as the first mediocre governor of Minnesota over his nefarious role in the Dakota War? What do we value? Now, as a historian, I can't resist teaching a little bit. So here comes a history lesson. A little change of gears. I want to give you a quick history of history. As a historian, it's hard for me to stop talking, especially about history. If you recall from the Harry Potter books, it was Professor Binns, the history professor at Hogwarts, who was so amused by his own lectures, he didn't notice that halfway through one he had died. He just continued lecturing. My research as a historian involves the creation of history, particularly of world history, which actually starts with the creation of Western history or Western civilization, the narrative of Western civilization. It was this gentleman, James Harvey Robinson, a professor at Columbia University between 1900 and 1920, who invented this history. Now, before Robinson created the narrative of Western civilization, with it, our own historical narrative, much of the way people looked at history in the United States was using the Bible as the main source. This was how history was viewed. There was no sense of a progressive narrative. There was no sense of primary source research. It was not the story of progress. It's not the story of civilizations. We all probably have this narrative of Western Civ backgrounded in our heads because it's what the story that we've been told this whole time. Civilization starts in Mesopotamia and Egypt with agriculture. It spreads to Greece. They put on a bunch of plays. The Romans take over Greece and they change some of the gods' names. Rome gets crushed by barbarians, and then you get the Dark Ages. The Renaissance rediscovers Greece and Rome thanks to the scholarly work of Muslims. Then the Protestant Reformation happens, which leads to the Enlightenment, and boom, suddenly we're in the 20th century. When the United States was founded in 1776, none of the founders of our nation would have thought of history in this way. History changes. It's malleable, both in its approach and especially in its story. The history we have largely been taught is the triumph of Western civilization over everyone else. And of course, Western civilization is defined as being white, being Christian, mostly being male, and being in Western and Northern Europe. Think about the implication. History is the triumph of white men over everybody else. Even though we as modern historians have challenged aspects of Robinson's invented history, we still teach the basic outline of it. Here at MSU, the faculty of the history department, led by Drs. Johannes Postma and Dr. Bill Lass, changed the Western Civ course into the world civilization courses that I teach today. Unfortunately, they did less to change the actual content of the course and instead basically taught the same course with a different title. In many ways, they were at the mercy of the textbooks, and the textbooks literally did the same thing. In fact, one textbook survives, written by the same author, Heritage of World Civilization and the Heritage of Western Civilization. They just literally print basically the same book. In my research, I referred to the old Western civilization narrative as the trunk of history. Think of a tree. What has happened is that all of our diversity and inclusion of non-Western history is just grafting limbs onto that original tree, a process I call grafting. The ultimate point I'm trying to make here is that modern history reproduces the original assumptions that the West is the best and the West is white, Christian, and male. At least that's what history is. So we have to ask, whose story do we honor when we name a park after Sibley? Why do we uphold the supremacy of whiteness? Therefore, we are not erasing history. Objection number 2. When I was a kid, I've seen this on the Facebooks. When I was a kid, I went to Sibley Park. If you change the name of the park, you're going to ruin my childhood. And I say to this, well, I grew up in New York on Long Island, very close to New York City, and I could walk to this little park, Christopher Morley, very similar in size to Sibley. Has a lot of similar stuff. We got an ice rink. We don't have any animals. We got a swimming pool there. Christopher Morley was an early 20th century writer who was a sort of blend of Hemingway and Henry David Thoreau. He was a novelist whose most famous work, Kitty Foyle, was turned into a series on NBC in 1958. There's even a little cabin he built for himself that was moved to the property. That cabin looks a lot like Ott's cabin. That's over there at Sibley. I used to walk to this park and play basketball, swim, hike in the woods, and so on. Many of my fondest memories were made in this park. However, if you told me that Christopher Morley had served in, time appropriately, the First World War, and like Sergeant York, had captured 132 German prisoners of war, marched them back to Long Island, imprisoned them, put them on trial, and condemned them to die, you know, I'd want to rename that park. So I would say it's better to say, as an adult, I realized the problem with the name, even though I went there as a kid, and I helped change it. And now I can bring my kids to Dr. Barbara Keating Park and tell them that I helped to rename it. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about the toppling of statues. And one of the things about renaming Sibley Park and the way that we're doing it And I say we because the Kessel Peace Institute isn't actually the only person working on this, and it certainly isn't just me. Removing statues is it's a process that involves a sudden change, but not an institutional change. What we're looking for is real introspection here in Mankato. This is a statue of Andrew Jackson in Washington, D.C. that was pulled down. And when you change an institutional narrative, then people really think about it. And if we came together as a city and really went through a very public process of renaming this park and really thought about it, it's going to be much better than any sort of action taking in a direct move such as this. But yet it fits in the same context because, you know what, while I disagree with the methods, I don't disagree that this statue should have come down. Now, furthermore, I want to state that I believe that Sibley Park should be renamed. Action should be taken to dismantle systems of injustice and not just the symbols behind them. And although changing symbols together and acknowledging how the past has been falsely recorded is important, it's the manner in which we do it that's more important. Institutional change. Due to the extraordinary and heinous actions of Sibley, we should not have a park named after him. This is even more true because of not just because of the historical crimes that Sibley is tied to, but the fact that they occurred in the confines of that park. While today it is all barnyard-themed playgrounds and baby goats, in the past this was Sibley's prison camp, where he held trials that dispensed only injustice. History is not and never has been a truly accurate picture of the past. Instead, it is the way we view the past that informs how we move into the future. I want to live in a Mankato that's welcoming, not only to white people, not only to the white historical story, but to all people. I want Mankato to be what America promises to be. We can't make our country live up to that promise right now, but we can work to live up to the ideals of a pluralist, welcoming society that does not privilege imperialist stories over all others. Next steps. How does one change a park name in Mankato? Should we add a monument? Both. Name changes. Mike Lagerquist Park has a great sound to it as well. And we really need to think about who will be honored and welcomed in our history. And I put up a little bit of reading for you if you're interested in learning a little bit more. I'm happy to hear from you and work with all of you. You can email me there at peace@mnsu.edu. Thank you all for having me here. I look forward to having a discussion with everybody.
All right. If anybody has questions, please feel free to unmute themselves and verbally raise your hand, I guess it would be.
I do have a question. It's been something that's been on my mind here since this process is going to be working on renaming this park. I'm very curious about the input from the Dakota peoples themselves. That's something that I definitely feel should be really addressed here in this discussion today. Quite simply, their input, their participation, their perspective on naming that park, I feel really should be taken into account, especially since this is a move towards reconciliation. I'm really curious about what level of participation we have with the Dakota peoples and so on. So I'll just mute myself and I'll listen to your response.
Thank you, Tom.
That's a great question. Well, let me talk a little bit more about the process. So my plan here is a 3-step process. Step 1 is to announce the initiative, which happened months ago. Step 2 is to coalition build and gather people together and start making these presentations. And then step 3 is direct action, which will probably likely not happen until early next year or even next summer. There's no rush to do this. We have been in contact with everybody we could possibly be. If you have individuals you want, you think should be involved, I guess I can talk about whoever's involved, but certainly we have many members of the Dakota community here in Mankato involved. And I want to point out too that this is not, actually, let me make a plug here for Megan Schnittker. Megan Schnittker is running for school board. She is one of the Indigenous leaders here in Mankato. She's working very closely with me on this, and she's fantastic. Vote for her for school board. So yes, we are working with particularly local Dakota leaders of the WASCP, Mankato WASCP, and as well as in coalition with lots of people, and anybody can be involved. And I think we're going to delay sort of the actual action plan until after the election. I think people are heated enough right now. They don't need to be any more heated, because I've had people cursing me out that have never even met me, people questioning my motives from right and the left, and they don't know anything about it. And I'm a peaceful guy. I don't want anybody mad at me. So we're going to let things cool off a little bit, but I think the next step is city council. So we'll probably be taking this to city council and getting them to try to vote to rename the park. As far as I can see it, the park is what I'd like to see happen. And when I say I mean myself as a leader, but not the leader. And this, I should need to acknowledge that, this is not a new thing. Kessel's involvement is direct involvement like this is new, but people have been trying to get the name of Sibley Park renamed for a long time. So there are a lot of people who have been involved are helping me out. And I'd like to see the park have two names, a Dakota name and a Mankato name, or just the Dakota name. But, that's I think the first stage is a dedication of the idea of changing the park. I estimate, and I don't know if anybody has a little more insight into this, I think all it would take fiscally, which could be an objection, of course, is just a few $1,000s to replace the sign on, gosh, I don't know what street that is. Is it still Riverfront?
Sibley, actually, or no, that's
Is that
Park Lane,
or Park Avenue.
Park Lane, I think.
Park Lane?
I think.
Park Lane, and then the big sign actually in Sibley Park would be expensive too. But I think then in Mankato we also have a Sibley Street. I think that's a little more complicated, because then how do you get the mail rerouted if you change the name of the street, and that would have to involve the people there. I envision this too as a pretty much a Mankato thing. I am looking for people mostly or entirely from Mankato to be involved in this.
All right, Stephanie, you have a question?
Yes, the title of this meeting or presentation today disturbed me a little bit. When was it determined that this is an issue of reconciliation and that it needs to be done? Since the park was known as Sibley Mound as early as the 1840s, and if you look at it in much the same way, just flip the magnifying glass, Sibley was a humanitarian. Since more than 300 were to be executed, Sibley did not allow that. Sibley offered food and shelter to the 1,500 who were abandoned by their own tribe from those who escaped. And I'm just wondering, this seems to be rather extreme to take a park that was named for the location of the 1840s trading stop, Sibley Mound, and to toss it, chuck it out the window because of what people are now perceiving it to be today, whereas then it was perceived to be a humanitarian procedure. I'm just interested in that. I'll let you know that.
Thank you, Stephanie. No, I actually would be curious to know. Okay, I grew up in New York, so I never heard of Sibley. I never heard of Mankato. I thought when I moved here, I thought it was called Mankato. So I didn't grow up with these stories in my education. What I have come to learn about this since I have moved here 6 winters ago disturbs me. Now, if you're telling me that you have legitimate historical sources that say the opposite, I'd be very curious to read them. Are there books I can read that have this narrative of Sibley as a humanitarian? Because everything I've read paints the opposite picture.
Well, if you read on, as you did portray in your presentation, there were 300. There was a plot to kill all of them by Sibley's men, and Sibley nixed it. He did not allow it.
But
I believe that they were acquitted by President Lincoln
yeah, I
and
don't.
not by Sibley. I think that's what happened. They were acquitted.
If it's possible, I think Stephanie might be referring to there was some allegations that mob justice was going to take place, and the townspeople or the soldiers were going to kill the prisoners, and that Sibley prevented that. That does not mean, though, that Sibley wasn't going ahead with the execution of the 300. It was Abraham Lincoln who interceded on behalf of them. So Sibley did want the 300 men executed. But this is exactly what I'm saying for history.
I do feel that's an interpretation on your part of the records. Ishi's book of the war trials.
What's the name?
You let it be known.
What's the name, Stephanie? Ishi?
Ishi, I-S-C-H-E.
I-S-C-H-E. And the title?
It's something of the Dakota war trials.
Okay.
And it does have those in there for you. And then there are letters that Sibley wrote to his wife at the time, some primary documentation that really does show Sibley's torn self between two cultures and his striving to obey both cultures in the sense of what was culturally appropriate at the time, compared with what he felt was an equal acknowledgement of both cultures. Sibley was deeply entwined in Dakota culture.
Okay, I'll take this into consideration. I'll read this book.
I'll forward you some information.
I would appreciate that. Thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate your insight, but I still disagree completely.
Jameel, have you been able to do any research locally to find out at the time when it was named Sibley Park, what the arguments were that were brought forward for that?
No, I haven't actually been able to figure out when it was officially named Sibley Park. And yeah, it seems that what Stephanie's saying about Sibley Mound, this was an encampment that Sibley had here when he was a fur trader. Mm-hmm. Again, though, it should have had an earlier indigenous name before that, but I don't know that there's ever any city park, city like official naming of the park.
That might be in Thomas Hughes' book.
Okay, Thomas Hughes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the thing about the Thomas Hughes book, of course, is written at the time of the events, and it is very, very slanted toward the white perspective.
That's true, but I just mean the naming of Sibley Park. Maybe he made a reference. I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate Stephanie's point. I'm open to naming the park, but one of my concerns is the issue of presentism, where we apply 21st century values to behaviors in the 19th century. That's always a bit of a concern for me. I've lived here 39 years, and the only thing I knew about Sibley was that he was the first governor, so it made sense. And then the Lifelong Learners Science and History group read this book, 38 Nooses, which gives a more negative view of Sibley. And I would like to hear all sides before we make a decision, rather than just the negative or just the positive. One of the issues, I remember when I would quote Thomas Jefferson, I would have students dismiss him completely because he was a slave owner. Well, in the 18th century, he was ahead of his time, but by 20th century standards, he was way behind the value system. So presentism, I think, is an issue. I think, renaming to what is an issue. We don't want a name that will be out of date in another 50 years because we've named it something, that's appropriate in 2020 and then is not appropriate in 2060. So something more general, I suppose. And I'm real intrigued, Jameel, you've gotten criticism from the left. What is their criticism of that? I mean, I understand the right-wing criticism because I've seen more of it.
It is in some way just about who gets to speak,
Oh, okay.
and who should be. I think when I announce this or when people talk about it, we have this tendency within our culture to think of like great man in history stories. So like I am doing this, right? And I am not doing this. Groups of people are doing this, right? I'm just the one speaking today. So it's criticism on that. I do see your point about presentism, and that's my point about history, though. Mm-hmm. I think that, and my point is like, obviously there's going to be multiple interpretations. This is exactly what I'm saying. So what Stephanie's saying and what you're saying, Dr. Keating, there's definitely truth to it. However, my argument is that when we have so many options here in Mankato, think about the beautiful little park near my house, Malda Farnham Park. This is tiny little park named after a woman who took it upon herself to take care of an open green space. We have a band shell named after a saxophone player. Why do we have to stay with Sibley Park? Because it sends a message to people who aren't white. And even if there are other versions of the truth, those things are more true for certain people. Okay. I don't want, and like I said, I don't want the park renamed at first. I think the first step is to have the city commit to renaming the park and then the city getting together and renaming the park. I'd love to see it called Page Park. Page Park being from the Betsy Tacy books. River Bend Park has also been mentioned to me. But I think it's also important to acknowledge, as we usually do at MSU events, that we're on native land. Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of question to the legality of how this happened. And so we need to acknowledge that. And that's why I think the park should also have a Dakota name. I don't, I do see your point, and I don't think that, I'm dismissing it, but I still think that the history is definitely, and I'm excited. I haven't read 38 Nooses yet. I'm excited to read it.
Right. Stephanie, you had another question?
Yeah. She's muted.
Stephanie.
Yeah, you're muted, Stephanie.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that as it stands or appears based on the narratives being presented to the public, that Sibley Park is not inviting to all cultures. However, if one looks at the diversity that Sibley himself imposed himself in or found himself in through love relationships and the family ties, both of the Dakota culture and European culture, you've got to look at this guy as being ahead of his time as far as ethnicity, mixed race, or as they called it then, mixed blood. And while people can deliberate or say, oh, he abandoned that family or whatever he did, nonetheless, it was still huge for diversity and inclusion. And by making assumptions based on 20th century judgments of lifestyle or actions made in an 18th or 19th century, it's being perceived to people that are not familiar with the history that Sibley is not synonymous with inviting all cultures and not just what they consider now to be the white superiorism that he has. And I think I haven't heard the term presentism before, but Dr. Keating does have a point about, well, okay, when do you switch it again? When you already have multiculturalism right there, and someone from a place that was titled in the 1840s, which is pretty close to pre-contact. When you think of 1830s as the cutoff for that, that just really seems to be something that needs to be taken a few steps back within the conversation of this. And how do you change a perception based on two very strong presence or decades, eras, and pull one person into both?
I think
It
hope
really is something that plays back into this. We're already into reconciliation, and it seems to be coming up at the expense of one name, when really it's based on a place that was a trading post, and no one was forced to go there, and no one has mentioned any of that per se. Sorry, my commentaries get a little long, but I just want to pull that out for all to be thoughtful of.
I
trying
certainly
time.
would support a commission studying this for a while and getting all perspectives into it, because I'm not opposed to changing the name. I just don't want it to be done because it's 2020 political correctness. I want it to be contextualized. Excuse me. When I arrived in 1981, Mankato was just starting the reconciliation process, and we took a decade. I'm not saying we need to take a decade for this park, but a year of regular study, public hearings, etc., I think would be appropriate. And then coming up with a good name. For example, it's the confluence of the two rivers. I don't know what the Dakota word for that is, but that might be more appropriate than naming it after a person, for example. So let's study it some more. And I would be disappointed if it came up in a city council meeting and they voted that Monday evening, and I read about it Tuesday morning and there'd been no input.
Thank you, Dr. Keating. Actually, I'd love it if you would email me and follow up a little bit more with that information about the committees to study this, because I am new to trying to rename a park. I don't go around throwing park names all over town. I honestly didn't even know. I would love to see this as a plebiscite, even if that's possible, on the ballot one year. Like I said before, I'm in no rush to judgment, and I'm in no rush to. Obviously, when I got here 6 years ago, I heard about all this, and it's all 6 years later, I start doing something about it. And like I said, this is information gathering and coalition building stage. So the slower the process, the better the process, as far as I'm concerned. I'm going to fundamentally disagree with almost everything Stephanie said. I don't see how that has anything to do with inclusion. I don't think the narrative of American history is inclusive of the Native people. Hernan Cortez also had a Native child in Mexico. It doesn't mean that he was should be so celebrated in his narrative of the destruction of Mexica culture. So I understand your where you're coming from as far as the narrative, and I just disagree with it. So, and I just can't see how that it has anything to do with inclusion or diversity.
It would play forward, though, to consider it, just as it would be necessary prior to a city council meeting to review what Mankato does have for a Heritage Preservation Commission, as does the city of St. Paul and others, as well as the other considerations of the other tribes. Since in 1856, it was clear that the Dakota were losing more land because of their fights with the Ojibwe right in Blue Earth, because it wasn't the Dakota land as it is so generally stated today. It belonged to the Oto, Iowa, Cree, and several others. And Dakota were losing their land quickly. They had been pushed from the Mille Lacs area, which is their claimed homeland. Not now, but in the 1688 with the French and explorers, that was their homeland, and the archaeology states to prove it. So I think this is something to consider, is not just tribes that have claim to it or speak loudest, but all tribes, and not just those that are federally recognized. There are several others that are no longer on the radar because they're not federally recognized. And I have several people that can speak to that.
No, that's really interesting to learn about. I'm pushing back against your idea that Sibley, these events that happened represent diversity and inclusion and multiculturalism. That's what I'm arguing.
Okay, I'm going to take this opportunity. Rick has been waiting very patiently to ask a question. So Rick, if you'd like to go ahead. Are you still with us, Rick?
Dr. Liebeck.
Sorry about that. I always forget to unmute. Yeah, it isn't so much to ask a question, it's just to chime in a little bit. A lot is said about presentism, right? With the assumption that we're taking, we're looking back at the past with modern politically correct lenses or something like this. And in looking out for that, we often forget about pastism. That is assuming the illusions of the people from the past, right? As we interpret history. And our host pointed out that, well, if you go to Thomas Hughes's history, for example, and he was more of a moderate contemporary, you'll find basically a white supremacist take on things, right? And it's very hard not to find that in any white sources from 1860s and on, right? And so looking at Sibley only as a humanitarian figure, etc., is actually to replicate that past view, right? That's pastism, actually. And so, sure, there are always, like with figures like Thomas Jefferson, et cetera, there's going to be a triumphalist view, and there's also going to be a dark view, right? And this is democracy, the history of democracy itself, not just individuals, right? It has dark sides to it as well, right? And so just a few things with Sibley, for example, having a Dakota wife, you needed that in order to have the kinship ties that were necessary for trade, right? And he dominated the fur trade really early on here. And he actually made millions, the equivalent of millions today, off of the conflict. And so this is something, these are facts. This isn't opinion. This part too is fact that can't be so easily set aside, right? And so Mary Wingard's book is good on this. David Nichols's book, Lincoln and the Indians, is good on this. Rhoda Gilman's Divided Heart is very good on this, right? And so all of it needs to be read carefully. And so one thing about that is, what I would say is, even the very sort of, what I'd call like friendly interpretations of Sibley. Rhoda Gilman, who writes very sort of sympathetically about Sibley, for example, in Divided Heart, also actually very directly has to account for the fact that genocide was policy, even though the word itself wasn't used. She says this directly in her book. Genocide was the policy of Sibley's day, and when it came time to act, when white settlers had been killed, he really didn't have much of a choice on this. His job was to enact policy, right? And so it was to exterminate the Dakota people, as Alexander Ramsey said, must be done either or driven from the borders of the state. And so you have to look at Sibley's profits, his statements of the day, if you go into Mary Wingard's book, which is also not such a critical take, but is also very factual about the kind of propaganda against Dakota people that Sibley engaged in the day, as he simultaneously had a Dakota wife and family relations. These are the contradictions that are fact-based and can't be so easily looked away from. So if we're going to say that he took humanitarian action, as he advocated for 393 or something like this to be hanged, right? We're also going to have to say, well, he took part in the punitive expeditions in 1864 and 1865 as well, right? So we can't only have it one way. And so certainly looking back from modern eyes, it looks interesting. Sibley spoke many languages. He had a Dakota wife and Dakota family relations. At the same time, factually, he did very, very many like repulsive things too, right? And all of it has to be considered for a more complete vision of history that takes both presentism into account, but also pastism, which we run the risk of by keeping it Sibley Park. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Rick. I think Rachel Iverson might have a question. Rachel.
Hi, so I'm gonna try, I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
So I really agree with what Rick said. And then what came to me with Stephanie's, what she was trying to assert really reminded me of a Free Press article from 2019 after there was a bit of a protest in Sibley Park, where the author Tim Crone, quote, said, "It's difficult to paint Sibley, the state's first governor, as a murderous, moralist leader of genocide." That really reminds me of what the narrative Stephanie was trying to push, where saying that Sibley was just this fur trader, the father of a half Dakota daughter, a friend to the Dakota people, and saying it's a stretch to say he was anything but just this governor, just this kind of spearhead for Minnesota. And same with the argument saying, oh, we named Sibley Park because he has the fur trading post there, all of that. I think that's a really problematic viewpoint to have, in addition to the idea that we've already done so much reconciliation. We have Reconciliation Park, we have statues at the library. Now we have this mural, beautiful mural, celebrating them. But can you really say there's enough healing? I mean, can you really heal enough? Does that cure you? Or is it just medicine that you're taking for a chronic condition? And I feel like this is a fight that will always be going on because racism is a chronic condition in America. And it's not something, in my opinion, that can just be cured. It's something we have to continually take medicine and monitor. And I think for Mankato, something of us coming together and celebrating, the Dakota people, those who suffered at the hands of Sibley. And I mean, I like the idea of naming it Page Park, something like that, but I think to really not erase history, you do need to acknowledge the people who suffered there. And I think that's why it should have maybe a Dakota name. And I don't speak Dakota. I have no idea what it would be, but I love the idea of like when Lake Calhoun was changed to Bide Makaska, where it is something that they used to call it and still would call it. So that would be my name suggestion of just letting them kind of come up with different ideas. But yeah, that was my 2 cents.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Yeah, this is exactly the point I'm trying to make, is that we're not just changing symbols, we also need to correct history and correct the institutional biases and racism that are built into them. And part of this is the things that we name our public spaces.
And Stephanie, did you have another comment, or was that your hand still raised? I couldn't tell.
Thank you. With regard to, since the issue of genocide came up, to give this park a Dakota name would be to reward a culture who started genocide in Minnesota with the statement to kill all whites. That was the orders given to the Dakota on the 18th. That was what everything was being said and done. And that is pretty prevalent in research. If someone needs it, I'll dig it up, find it for you and forward it. But to bring up genocide from the 20th century view and not to include the words from the other view from the 19th century and how everything started is a wrong that our cultures today can't afford to wrong either side. If it's going to be there, it should be there as it was in narratives then on both sides. And to do that, and as Rachel mentioned too, at what point is reconciliation enough? At this point, I have consoled people who have been so terrorized again by all of this reconciliation because their families were obliterated in 1862 and on. And in 1864, families were completely decimated from the earth forever. That branch was gone. And
Stephanie,
that's something that needs to really be considered here to be a reconciliation for all. It's a time to come together, not to put down or put forward or put out,
well, thank you.
but to come together and equalize.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think that when we look at American history, though, we're looking at a genocide of one group of people over another, and it is towards the native indigenous peoples of Americas that this happens, where 90% of them are displaced and killed. That's millions and millions of people. And I am very sorry for any families that were hurt during any war. I'm personally opposed to all war and all violence. And you're right, that shouldn't have happened to them. But to say that this was a genocide against white people is grossly misstating history. This is in the context of it. Stephanie, please.
It is in the documentation.
I'll just stop talking then. Thank you.
Well, I think one of the things that this is really bringing up is the fact that most of us are very uneducated on this time in our own history. So if anything comes out of this, I hope it will be a greater awareness of what happened and what didn't happen, and even a wider conversation about perhaps how we record history and share that for future generations and the impact that has on future generations.
I'd like to say one thing. I think we need to read a lot of sources, and we need to look back further in history, look back to things that Thomas Jefferson said about what we were doing in this country long before the 1860s in terms of what happened to the people that were living here before the Europeans came. And then you'll see it in a bigger context, I think, if we read a lot of sources. It started before the US-Dakota War, and it started before the Dakota were in Minnesota even. That white people were coming in and making treaties and taking over, and they felt that was what they were going to do. And you can see what Thomas Jefferson said a long time before that about it. So you got to kind of read a lot of sources to sort of see it in perspective, because it does get nuanced at times. And Thomas Jefferson and Henry Hastings Sibley are not all bad or all good, but there's kind of a mixed bag in the things that they say.
Absolutely, Susan. And when we look at the long span of American history, we are looking at a genocide of white European settlers against the native peoples of America. And that's not like a debated historical fact, but we should acknowledge that there are aspects to stories that are not wrong, but that is the overarching story of American history: the enslavement of peoples, the disenfranchisement of peoples, and the taking away of their land as a plan. Even into the 20th century, Woodrow Wilson wouldn't have disagreed with any of this. And he wasn't a slave owner, and he had a lot of very positive impacts on the world. But he believed in white supremacy. Theodore Roosevelt was a white supremacist. Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan were incredibly racist presidents. Did they do things that were good for certain people? Sure. But in the long span of American history, we have a lot of things that we need to, a lot of promises we've made that have been actually pretty much the opposite of our actions. Thomas?
You know, I really do have to echo your sentiments with that too. I mean, we really do need to be taking a long view on history. That is an extremely important thing to do when we have these discussions. You know, especially when we take a look at what happened in that park. That's something that I think we really need to be remembering here. This is where the trials happened. This is where the decisions about who was going to live and who was going to die happened. We really need to be mindful of the fact that you know, history is something that's really not a democratic process. It's written by the winners, and the winners by and large here were the white settlers that took over the whole of this continent and laid waste to the indigenous peoples that were here. And if we're going to be making a good faith effort in order to work on that reconciliation process here in Mankato, we absolutely do need to have indigenous voices involved in this entire process. And you know, it's sort of a part of the larger vision of how we go about reconciliation in and of itself. Because there's a lot of issues that are really, really important in the indigenous communities, not only here in Minnesota, but across the country. The fact of murdered indigenous Native women is a really tremendous issue. The fact that every single one of the treaties that we've ever that the United States has ever entered in have been violated. Death, disease, starvation, these are all things that are still happening within these indigenous communities. And you know, it's good to be taking the view that we need to be addressing the name of places and parks and stuff like that. That's good iconic things. But a thing I think that we need to be focused on here is what sort of substantive change does that have for indigenous peoples? Aside from just renaming the park itself, shouldn't this be something that's open up for the idea of actual usage of the park, that the indigenous people should have a little bit more of a voice in that as well too? So I know there's a lot of different things that I'm all trying to kind of pull together here, but having the input of the Dakota people whose land that we are on, whose land was taken from them, and the lives of their loved ones that were taken from them during the Dakota conflict, and not only at the hanging, but also the trip from New Ulm to Mankato, and then the subsequent trips up to Fort Snelling, and all of the innocent indigenous peoples that were captured and forcibly moved and killed at that time, that we need to be taking those things into account here too. And I really feel that, you know, as had kind of been stated before, you know, we don't necessarily want to just be looking with 20th century eyes on something that had happened in the 19th century. But, you know, I think it's an important thing though, too, to hold ourselves accountable and to hold our predecessors accountable as well, too. At that time, it was very much more in vogue, and the style and the path of the nation, that we were going to be laying waste to these people. And I think that we need to acknowledge that and to make amends to that. And it's a really good step forward here with looking at renaming this park, but we really need to ask that question about what substantive change can come to the to the Native Americans and their communities, and to really help promote their well-being and their thriving in the present and in the now. And how is this part of renaming this going to fit into the context of that overall direction that we are headed?
All right. Thank you, Thomas. Say, Stephanie, I can't tell if your hand is still up from before or if you have something again to say. No, okay. I just didn't want it to be to overlook you. Anybody else have some general thoughts to share with Jameel? It's been a great conversation. I hope that's been helpful for Jameel, and I can make this recording available for you too. So
Yes, thank you, Jameel. It was very thought-provoking.
Thank
Appreciate
you,
it.
Dr. Keating.
of course she says that you named the park after her.
Yeah.
I
By
also
the
named
way, I have specified that the endowment I'm giving to MSU should not be named after me. I
Wow.
think those things should be named after, it's being named the Sociology Student Professional Development Endowment. It doesn't have my name because I want other emeriti to donate to it also. So I disagree with naming things like scholarships, et cetera, after people. I think they should be named after the principle or the value, but that's just my own idiosyncrasy, I understand.
Yeah, I
So
think
I
it falls,
appreciate the sentiment, Jameel.
it falls under the whole desire for branding, I think, because I think about all the scholarships we have, they're all named after somebody because
Right.
branding.
Well, I was going to say when I was at MSU, I received the Franklin Rogers Scholarship. So let's not even get started on that one. Anybody else have any contributions, any comments, just general remarks? It's been, like I say, a great conversation. We certainly, yes. Now Stephanie's hand is up.
I don't even remember the name of the scholarship and the endowments I received when I was at Mankato. That may be dating myself.
Just a side issue. I agree that the statues of Christopher Columbus should come down, but never by mob violence. I disagree with protest violence, protest vandalism, because that simply creates more victims that don't get recognized. We need to consider all sides. And I actually wrote a letter that got published in the Star Tribune after the Christopher Columbus statue came down. I think it needs to be restored, and then we can consider it, because I don't think mob violence should ever be rewarded with success. So I know that's complicated. I agree it should come down, but not the way it came down.
Yeah, I mean, the Kessel's committed to nonviolent action as well.
Yeah, that's very important to me.
Absolutely.
I would concur with that sentiment too, and all the more reason to change the name of the park, because that really was a result of mob violence.
Right.
That these mass executions, the way that the indigenous peoples were treated before that, that was all components of mob violence in and of itself. So all the more reason to change it.
Okay, good point. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, everybody, for your opinions. Even if I disagree with you guys, I still appreciate it.
I agree that the Columbus statue needs to go back up because of the way in which it was torn down. But I believe that with regard to that, it needs to be considered the art first, and then the reasons and what the statue represents. But I don't feel that mob violence is something that fits into Sibley Park. Or there may have very well been an extermination of the Dakota in Mankato. Had that occurred, yes, I would be in view of, no, let's rename that park. But yeah, I guess I kind of disagree there.
I guess one thing that I can speak about, I'm the incoming president for the Mankato Kiwanis Club, and we are celebrating 100 years in Mankato next year. And we are looking at something to possibly do to make an impact in Mankato. One of the areas we're looking at, because it has become the site of the Kiwanis Holiday Lights, is something in Sibley Park. So that's all in even pre-discussion phases, but that's something that I would like to see happen.
Thanks, Michael. Keep that in mind too. Yeah.
All right. All right. Well, once again,
I think Natalie has something quick to say.
Oh,
Natalie?
Hi, my name's Natalie Rademacher. I'm new to Mankato. I'm also a new reporter at the Free Press. So nice to meet everybody. I should have introduced myself in the beginning, but I'm writing a little bit about the renaming efforts. And if anyone's interested in talking more about their thoughts on this, I'd love to chat with you guys. I won't use anything you guys have said in this meeting unless you come and talk to me, just to respect your privacy. But I'd love to get to know you guys and chat if anybody's interested. And nice to meet everybody.
Thank you, Natalie. I look forward to talking to you more in the future.
and thank you, Natalie. I'm an old reporter from the Free Press, so
Oh, really?
back when, 1999.
We'll have to swap stories sometime.
Okay.
Oh, congratulations, Natalie, on your new job. I look forward to reading your writing.
And we can say we knew her when. All right. If there's no other comments, again, thank you all so very much. Jameel was probably not expecting such a lively conversation after a couple of presentations at service clubs that have been fairly moderate in how they've been received. But I think anytime we can get a good discussion going, it benefits everyone.
Absolutely.
Thank
All
you
right.
all.
Well, thank you all
Take
for
care,
finding
everybody.
out
Thank you for
today.
coming.